Hi, this is Lisa, and you are listening to I Love That Movie. This podcast is for movie lovers. It's not an unbiased opinion, it's not a straightforward review, it's just a couple people talking about a movie that they love. The format is each week I have a guest, and that guest and I discuss a movie that they love, something they're obsessed with, something they connect with. We'll talk about the plot, the director, and the actors, but we'll also talk about the personal connection my guest has with that movie. So if that sounds like something you want to listen to, keep listening. Hey, this is Lisa, and if you want to catch up with me on Twitter, you can find me at ILTM Podcast. I'm also on Instagram at I Love That Movie Podcast, and we have a Patreon. The show is always free, but if you want to support us on there, you can. That's at patreon.com/I Love That Movie. And if you sign up now, you do get a bonus episode. Every week where I do like a weekly roundup. And right now we're covering The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. In fact, this weekend, or actually by the time you hear this, will be almost to the last episode. So if you want to hear me talk to a guest about that show, we also covered WandaVision, we covered The Mandalorian. So like stuff that's mainly on TV that doesn't fit in the movie genre, you can go ahead over there. And for as little as $1 a month, you get to listen to it. I want to take a moment to thank my top patrons. They are Chris Balga, Jeff Widman, Michael Cross, and Phil Barker. Thank you guys so much for keeping the lights on. And if you like what you hear today, please subscribe and rate the show. It does help new listeners find us. And I have a returning guest on the show today. I have Travis. Say hi, Travis.
Hi, how you doing?
Doing well. What was the last movie that you picked? I was
Hackers.
trying. Hackers. That's right.
Yeah,
Yes, that was a fun episode.
it was. It was.
Y'all
I
should
had
go
a
back and listen
wonderful
to that
time. Absolutely. That
after
movie
you're
is
done listening to this. Yeah.
yeah, that movie is better than it has any right to be. And I say that knowing full well that it's not good, but it's just so much fun.
Yeah. So, Travis, if people haven't heard that episode, did you want to introduce yourself just a little bit?
Sure, yeah. I do a couple of shows. My main show is called Wait You Haven't Seen. And it is a podcast where I review a movie every week, but it's a movie that either my guest or sometimes myself have never seen before. So it's always a first time watch for somebody. And it's fun to kind of take movies off of somebody's list of shame, or somebody bring me a movie that I've never seen before. And I just love to talk about movies. So it's a lot of fun. I also go episode by episode right now through Highlander the series.
Oh, I remember you
Um,
talking about that the last time you were on.
yeah, and that's been a ton of fun. And now it's getting more relevant as the Highlander reboot or remake or whatever they're going to call it is beginning to pick up steam. So
Yeah.
that'll be pretty cool. So yeah, I just love to talk movies and TV and pop culture, and it's the stuff that I grew up on. I was a child of the theater, so it's fun for me. And I love showing people a new movie. I have a pretty good track record of really only one movie that I've made somebody watch so far that they just didn't like. Um, so
um, you had me on there one time, and I think we talked about Sunset Boulevard.
yes, yes,
Yes.
that was fantastic. I can't believe I had not seen that before, but
Same.
that was a great movie.
It was. It was just. It's like you asked me what haven't I seen, and I said I picked that movie, and you were like me neither, and I'm like, oh, well, this is great. So yeah, go
Yeah.
listen to that show. But we are on this show currently. So, um, my guest always picks the movie. What movie did you choose to talk about today?
So I chose a movie from 1976 called Murder by Death. It is written by Neil Simon, and I refer to it when people, because it's one of those movies that a lot of people have never heard of, let alone seen.
Yeah, like they've heard
And
of the band Murder by Death.
right, exactly, yeah. Most people I talk to nowadays are like, "Yeah, I thought that was a band." But when people ask me, "Well, Murder by Death, what is that?" I tell them it's kind of like proto Clue.
I mean,
It's
I
that
would say a
same
lot. Yeah.
Yeah, it's that
Yeah.
same kind of dark haunted house or mystery house type movie where the whole thing takes place inside the house and that's it. Small cast, but all-star cast. Sort of a murder mystery. The thing I love about this particular movie is that it is a spoof on murder mystery stories, not necessarily just murder mystery movies. So all the
True.
characters are based off of literary characters, Agatha Christie characters, and whatnot. Are some of the main ones, and I just like the fact that it's a movie that it just is having fun. It's not taking itself seriously in any way, and the cast is really quite impressive when you look at who they are and who they're playing for the most part.
Mhm.
There are a few things about it that maybe haven't aged super great in the last 40 something years, which I'm sure we're going to talk about. But on the whole, like it's just a fun movie. And I enjoy a movie that doesn't have to take itself too seriously. And that's where the Clue kind of comparisons come in, because that movie is much more famous and that same zany kind of style with the weird characters and some kind of a murder mystery that there's no logic. None of it makes any sense. It's silly. And that's what this movie does. It just did it 10 years earlier.
Yeah, I think you mentioned, like, that you were listening to the Knives Out episode, is that right?
Yes.
That made you think about this, and, first of all, thanks for listening. And then secondly, I agree with you. I think that if you like that movie, and I feel like that's gonna become, like, the next Clue, where p we'll be saying in a few years, like, "Well, have you seen Clue?" You know?
Yeah, that's true.
Because the older I get, the less people I talk to that have seen that movie too. Um, but yeah, I saw this and I really do think it Clue owes a ton to this movie, and so does Knives Out. You can definitely see the groundwork being laid there, and I really, enjoyed my first viewing of it.
Yeah, it's one of those. I stumbled upon this movie. I don't even remember how old I was or where I saw it, because it was pre-streaming services. I want to say I might have even just been at my local library and saw the title Murder by Death, and I was like, okay, why not? I know Peter Falk, I know Peter Sellers, I know this I think Eileen Brennan, and I'm like, oh, and Alec Guinness. And I saw those names. I was like, sure, why not? I'll check it out. And I had no idea what I was getting into, and I loved it right away. Like it was just it grabbed me with the just insane nature of everything. And there's some
Yeah.
great like wordplay. There's different types of humor. There's some slapstick, there's physical comedy, but then there's also like really great just jokes and moments and stuff that I notice because I've seen this movie now a few times, and there's jokes that land better the more I watch it.
Oh yeah, I could totally see that. And before we go too much further, I do want to say this is not a spoiler-free show, so I always recommend you guys pause here, go watch the movie, come back. But I'm gonna read the synopsis really quick, and then we're gonna kind of dive into some quick facts and talk about the film.
Sure.
So here we go. Five diverse, infamous private eyes, including Sam Diamond, Sydney Wang, Jessica Marbles, are invited to a mysterious Lionel Twain's castle for a dinner party. There, they are told that Twain plans an unsolvable murder in the house at midnight, and he'll pay $1 million to the one who determines the killer. But when Twain's blind butler, Ben Simum, dies long before the deadline, the stakes go up for the trap sleuths.
Hmm.
So, yeah, that's it in a nutshell. I have a couple of quick facts that I want to list out before we dive in further. The first
Sure.
one I have is that all the detectives in this movie, as we mentioned earlier, are parodies of the work of three authors. Dashiell Hammett, who's Nick Charles and Sam Spade, were the basis for Dick Charleston and Sam Diamond,
Yep.
respectively. Dame Agatha Christie, who's Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple, inspired Milo Perrier and Miss Marbles. Earl der Biggers, whose Charlie Chan was the basis for the Inspector Sidney Wang and his son.
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
And that's the kind of the crux of the whole thing, right? It's
It
this
is, yeah.
it's just tongue in cheek making fun of all of those um those characters, but not like in a way that isn't punching down. Um,
Yeah.
like there's a reverence to the characters themselves while still just kind of playing off the fact that it's ridiculous and they're ridiculous characters and concepts that kind of just got overplayed, and it's great. I would say we might as well let this one out and just get this out of the way now. Peter
For sure.
Sellers plays Inspector Sidney Wang.
Mhm.
Um, Sidney Wang is a Chinese inspector based off the character of Charlie Chan. Peter Sellers is not a Chinese man
No.
or Asian in any way. So it definitely it is the one thing about this movie that, and there are some jokes that come off very homophobic as well.
And I feel like in both of these cases, there's an explanation. I'm not gonna sit here and say that it justifies it, but there's a I guess, like, there's a line of thinking back then that they had
Mhm.
that they thought justified it, I guess.
Sure.
And I think once you get that context, not that again, not that it makes it okay, and it definitely wouldn't be done today, but you're like, I see what they were trying to do, it just doesn't land today, you know?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, for one, Peter Sellers, were he alive today, I'm pretty sure he would be like, yeah, maybe I shouldn't have done that.
Yeah.
But also at the same time, like he was from a school of acting where you played a character. It didn't matter who the character was or what the origin of that character was. That's who he played. Now, that's not necessarily that's not a good thing per se, and it certainly doesn't excuse him playing a character like this. But this is also such an over the top caricature. Um, Again, I'm with you. I'm not condoning it, and it certainly wouldn't happen today. But it was a different era of filmmaking and different sensibilities about that at the time.
For sure, yeah.
I did like, however, that the character of Willie, his adopted son, was played completely straight.
And I think that's what they were I think they were trying to make a statement with that because I think another we talked about these are based on certain characters. So I read an article today that was talking about the fact that Charlie Chan, the character that Sidney Wang is based on, is also kind of an offensive stereotype.
Hmm.
So it's sort of making fun of a stereotype, I think, is what they were
Yes.
going for. Like, this is what, Americans think Chinese people are like. And it's unbelievably non-passable for being Chinese and ridiculous and over the top. And, Peter Sellers, the stuff that they put on him to try to make him look, Asian is offensive, but it's also um really just ridiculous. Like I think it's you're meant to think this looks ridiculous. He sounds ridiculous,
Yeah.
almost like making fun of that. Um,
In
and
a
then
way,
by having
yeah.
his son in the picture who doesn't have like a ridiculous accent, who doesn't present himself as anything but just Asian American and
Mhm.
is smart and not a caricature, I think they're trying to say this is what Asian people are actually like. And then the Sellers character is sort of like what's been done on screen and in books and is not correct. And I
Yeah.
think people with they thought, okay, this is funny because it's Peter Sellers. Like you said, I think his style of acting today it's almost like improv, where it's like just really
Mhm.
over the top and like characters. And so they're thinking like people will think this is funny, and then we kind of have a get out of jail free card because his son is, played normally,
Sure.
and is actually Asian. But under today's lens, it's like, or you could not do that, not have
Also
that
very true.
character. And,
Yeah.
I think back then too, I feel like, and I said this to you earlier today, like, I think that people felt like, well, Peter Sellers has a French accent when he's, in the Pink Panther, and that's
Mhm.
okay. And like, they don't see, like, I don't feel like they understood the huge difference between those two things back then and how much more punching down it is to portray an Asian person because of the way that Asian people were just often portrayed in media and treated in this country. And so it's very different, but I could see them believing that they were doing something that was quote unquote okay.
Yeah.
So it definitely like took me by surprise. I messaged you earlier because I hadn't seen this film before, and I was like, oh no, he's gonna do this the whole movie. Because I think, I'm when you see something like this, it really automatically makes me think of like Breakfast at Tiffany's, right?
Yep. Yeah.
And it's like, well, what if the character from Breakfast at Tiffany's was the main character, and in the entire movie, it's like it makes it a lot harder to sit through. So, I say all that to say, if this is like a breaking point for you, I understand, but I agree with you too, where you're saying that you also kind of have to put it in its time, in the sense that unfortunately back then they did not see the issue.
Right.
I
Yeah.
don't think there were not enough voices to tell them like, hey, this is not a good idea. I mean, and if there were, they weren't listened to. So a lot has changed since then. you know
Absolutely. Yeah, if it's the type of thing, if it does bother you, number 1, completely valid. I fully understand and back you on that. Um and if it is something where you can look at it as what it is, cuz I do agree with you. I think it was meant to be caricature of caricature
Yeah,
in
almost like
order
making
to,
fun of the way Americans viewed Asian people and how off
yeah,
it
and
is.
pointing out just how ridiculous that is.
Yeah.
By having just the huge, like, he had false teeth. He purposely spoke with no articles or prepositions. In fact, there's several jokes about that in the movie.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I do think that's what it was. We're also not that far removed from John Wayne playing Genghis Khan in a movie. That
Yeah, I
wasn't
mean,
that long
this
before that, and that one is quite a bit different. Um,
for sure. And I mean, I was thinking of watching this, kind of trying to put it under a different lens. I was like, it kind of reminds me of like Tropic Thunder and Robert Downey Jr.
yes.
playing somebody who's playing a black person, to make fun of the way Hollywood whitewashes. But, I feel like that movie, as we get further away from it, people are like, well, I get what you were trying to say, but I still don't love it. And it's kind of like, I understand that, because it's it's like something that I think changes over time. It's like, well, I understand why they thought that was great then, but now we look at it under a different lens.
Hmm.
And I know there's a lot of, I know we're spending a lot of time in this. Sorry, we'll get to the movie. I wrestle with these thoughts a lot about how to approach an issue like this, especially because I mean we talk about a lot of old movies on here, and there's been a few that had controversial moments, and
Sure.
some people, they really feel like they just can't watch these movies, and I get that. But I
Absolutely.
also think that if you're a lover of classic cinema, that doesn't mean that you're unable to see the difference. You're kind of like, okay, I would not do this in this movie now. This is something I sort of have to overlook now. But I
Hmm.
would also argue that, like, even if you're not into classic films, you can pick a ton of movies from almost every era that have something like this in it that does not age well.
Oh,
And
sure.
like, I kind of, when I told you at first that I was like, oh, this is like, I don't know if I can handle this. And then I thought about it. I was like, well, I liked Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. That's
Hmm.
got a lot of problems. I like Goonies. That has a ton of problems. Honestly, even Clue has a few problems. And I
Sure.
love that movie too. So it's kind of like, I think it's something that it's okay to chat about, and it's okay to think about and work through. And like you said, you're valid if it's something you can't,
Hmm.
sit through. I get it, but I think that you can still enjoy these films and put them in their context, and I
Absolutely.
think that's okay to do. And
Sure.
honestly, when I read this about, they're based on other characters, and I read that article that I shared with you earlier today, I was like,
Hmm.
see, this is framing it in such a way that I'm understanding it a little bit better. And it
Yeah.
kind of reminds me of like Turner Classic Movies, when they do the like little forward in the beginning, and a lot of times they'll set up like what was going on in that time, or what you might see in this movie that you might be like, oh my gosh. And I think that that kind of education, honestly, it just adds to the movie. It doesn't take anything away from it, because I want to learn more about it anyway. And context really does matter. So yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I agree completely with all of that. So, but it's important to talk about that. It's important to mention it because it is a large part of the film, and it can be a breaking point for some people. And if it is, and it's the type of thing that's going to really bother you, then by all means don't watch the movie. Um, but you should, because it's quite a hilarious movie.
It is pretty
Um,
funny. The other fact that I had was although that the atmosphere, it's kind of it gives like vintage vibes, right? Like 1930s, 1940s, certain
mhm.
details in the story um kind of imply that, but there are some things in the background. There are some dates that you see throughout the film that it's actually in the 70s,
Yep.
and that aesthetic of it kind of reminds me of of Knives Out,
Oh,
of
absolutely.
Clue, because it's like, well, a Clue may have been set in a specific time period, but Knives Out, it's really now, but there are things about the movie that sort of evoke an older time.
Sure. Yeah, in fact, this movie was, I mean, it was meant to look like an old 30s, 40s movie to the point where they built all the exteriors on a soundstage.
Ah.
So instead of shooting an exterior at night out on a road somewhere, that was just a soundstage, and they used old school techniques like the a big rotating background for the cars. So they would just rotate the background and kind of jostle the car around, and that was it driving somewhere. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I love that the look and the atmosphere of it, and it's just the movie begins right away, and immediately you get the tone of everything. And it just goes, it cranks it up to 10 and then up to 11, and it just keeps making sillier and sillier things. I mean, I love stuff like the running gag of they walk into the house and then they look out the window and it's storming and raining, and they look out the open door and there's nothing. And later on he opens the window and it's actually raining on him. Like it's paid off well. There's so many good jokes like that, and there's a lot of just really well written humor in this
Yeah.
too.
I agree. And that brings me to like the last. I had one more fact. I was wrong. But
Okay.
immediately after completing the movie, Peter Sellers was so convinced it was going to bomb, he actually convinced the producers to buy back his percentage share in the movie, which
Yeah.
deprived him of a cut of the profits when it went on to become a hit.
Yeah, and the movie, like I say, it wasn't a blockbuster by any stretch, but it was enough of a hit that
Yeah,
he lost a little money there.
sure.
So but yeah, and outside of Peter Sellers, like the cast is just crazy. Eileen Brennan is one I always like because she was in Clue, so that was
Oh
cool to see
yeah.
her as playing a character in a similar movie 8 or 10 years later, or whatever it was. Um, so that was kind of cool. But Truman Capote
Yeah, that
in
surprised me again because I hadn't seen it before. I was like, "Oh,
and I think it
interesting."
was only like one of two movies that he acted in, that where he wasn't just
Yeah.
himself.
Yeah, I think that one and Annie Hall were
Yeah,
it,
yep.
right? Yeah.
James Coco, Peter Falk. Peter Falk is just everybody is having a blast, and I think that comes through in the movie, and that's really what elevates it. It's much like Clue in that way, where you can tell everybody's on set and having a good time, except one thing I did read, which was Estelle Winwood, who played the nurse, Mrs. Withers.
I think it was one of her last performances too.
Yes, it was. But her and Elsa Lancaster, who was Jessica Marbles, apparently had a long-standing feud.
Uh,
So their scenes were very tense to shoot on set, which is funny that they're playing opposite each other like that. But they had great chemistry either way, and I loved that. Like that pairing where she comes in and everybody assumes it's the old lady in the wheelchair that is, Jessica Marbles, and no, that's the nurse, and Jessica's taking care of her now.
yeah,
That was a fun reveal, and Estelle Winwood was just great. Like that's got to be such a fun type of character to play, where you just get to sit there and make like one or two little zingers every so often, and you
definitely
get
reminded me of the grandma in Knives Out,
yes, absolutely.
or
Um,
great grandma.
David Niven and Maggie Smith as Dick and Dora Charleston. Um, the play on Nick and Nora Charles. They were great. They had some of my favorite, like they have some of the moments where it's when I watch it again, I'm like, oh, that's even funnier now. Maggie Smith just hamming it up and just having a blast. They're the scene with them and Alec Guinness's Benson Mum as they're walking down the hallway and he's explaining his name is just great because it's the movie making fun of itself at that point too.
Right.
Because it's just this. I love wordplay humor like that,
Hmm.
and it's rapid fire. That's one of the reasons why I love like a show like Psych so much because Psych has that same type of humor, and that always lands so well with me. And it's like they just kept doing it and doing it and doing it, and finally, Dora's just like, okay, that's enough. I can't take anymore. So
Yeah, for me, obviously the names that stick out to me are, Maggie Smith that you mentioned, and I was telling you, what was winning me back to the light side was
yeah.
Peter Falk because I watched so much Columbo
Oh yeah.
when I was a kid, which is kind of weird, but I guess my dad watched it, so I watched it, and I just liked him.
Hmm.
And he had already been Columbo for a while at this point, right? Because
Yeah, he'd
the
been doing
show
Columbo
started.
for a little bit.
Man, I'm looking at the years, and did Columbo really run from 1971 to 2003? How is that possible?
Yeah, there was Columbo stuff going on for a while.
That's a
Um,
really, really long time. I did not realize that.
because they would put out like an episode every couple of years at one point.
Oh, okay, okay. I was
Yeah,
like,
it wasn't like seasons of the show from 71 to
"Oh, okay." I was
2003. It would
like,
be
"I
like
don't remember that."
they got more or less turned into kind of TV movies after
Okay,
after a
okay.
while.
Obviously need to revisit it, but I just remember thinking of it fondly. But yeah, and the director, Robert Moore, I think this was like his first movie. I think before this he directed Rhoda, right? The show
Yeah.
Rhoda.
Yep.
Mhm.
This was his first film and he went on to work on another Neil Diamond written one, The Cheap Detective, starring Peter Falk.
Mhm.
The next or 2 years later, I think. Um, and that one is one I haven't seen, but I watched the trailer for it, and now I kind of want to because it's the same. It's almost a more zany version of this kind of humor.
Yeah,
So
and to kind of, I guess, play off that a little bit, the writer Neil Simon,
mhm.
I'm most familiar with like The Odd Couple,
Yeah,
obviously, and this the humor in this movie very much feels like that. A lot of
absolutely.
dry zingers, and yeah, so um,
Yeah, and it's just great to get actors of some of this caliber, like
yeah.
Alec Guinness playing just the most ridiculous character possible, and just owning it, just going all out. And then you've got Nancy Walker as the maid, as Yetta, and that was where you got a lot of that physical humor, right? Because you got her, she's deaf and mute, and you've got a blind butler, so they can't communicate at all, and they're the only staff in the house. Um, and just Alec Guinness was just having a great time, and he has what I love about it is he gets to play like ends up playing like a half a dozen different characters because that one scene he goes through transformations like four
Yeah,
times.
that's true.
That is the most ridiculous thing.
This is like a year before Star Wars, right?
Yeah, rumor was actually he got the script for Star Wars was kind of brought to him while he was working on this.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, and he's so much fun. Plus, what a wonderful name, James Sir Benson Mum.
I
Like
know.
it's just so silly.
It's very
And
silly. It's like made up British name.
yes, exactly,
I love it.
exactly. But he plays it so well. Like he
Mhm.
does. It's that dry delivery that works, where the delivery of everything is earnest. What he's saying is beyond ridiculous, and so it just plays so well.
I totally
Um,
agree.
and yeah, and that's what everybody does. That's the great thing is it's all done with this wink and a nod, but it's like it's delivered earnestly. Peter Falk is being Sam Diamond, and he's already done doing Columbo, so it's just take Columbo and crank it up and do the hard
Yeah,
boiled
it's
detective thing.
Columbo plus, I think, Bogart, right?
Yes. Oh,
A lot
totally.
of and I think you talked earlier about how there's some homophobic stuff, which, by the way, there is in Clue as well, and I think it's for
Mhm.
the same reasons, but because he's playing this sort of ultra male machismo hard-boiled detective, I feel like at the time they were like, wouldn't that be funny if he's putting on this face of being so macho and then, he's gay
Yeah.
essentially. And so I think they were sort of making fun of that archetype a little bit, but these days you're like, well, it's still kind of punching down because, well, number one, you later find out that he's not gay, which it reminds me of again in Clue when he's like, I'm gonna go home and sleep with my wife.
Yeah.
It's like they couldn't even have that in there. Like at the very end, they're like, by the way, I'm also not gay. It's like, what? Who
Yeah.
cares? But I mean, we're looking at it through our lens, and I think back then it would have been so controversial that they almost have to take it back, you know? So I could totally see that part being offensive, but I also think it's like it's more making fun of the detectives and how
Oh,
ridiculous those characters are. Like also him like
definitely.
constantly turning her down is like a thing in like those movies. I
Yep.
there was an SNL skit a couple years ago, and I think it was J.K. Simmons plays Bogart. And no, you know what? I'm thinking of a different skit. It was with I think it was with a different guy, but uh someone's trying to kiss him and he's just doesn't do anything and they try to kiss him over and over and he's just standing there and he's playing Bogart. It's like that is kind of that was like a sort of a thing,
Yeah.
of him like rejecting women and how like it's like the manliest thing you can do for some reason,
I guess.
back
I don't know.
then. So
I
it's kind of like you have to kind of have that background to understand that character, you
Yeah, and
know.
I think if again, if this movie didn't immediately tell you it's not taking anything seriously at all, I
True.
could really get upset with it. But the movie isn't being serious. It's not taking anything serious. It's poking fun at these ridiculous stereotypes. And then it throws in something similar to the Sidney Wang character and his son being just played completely down the line. Uh, Sam Diamond is played this way, but then he has that one line where he's like, "Look, I never did anything with a man I wouldn't do with a woman." And it's like,
Yeah, and you're like,
okay.
"Well, wait a minute." So
So, yeah.
yeah. But it's also kinda like I think they also put that in there to just like, a lot of these characters have to have, like, this ridiculous scandal that comes out,
Yep. Yeah.
and that would have been a scandal at the time.
Oh,
In
sure.
Clue, there's a problematic scandal where and I never even thought about this watching Clue, but, when Jordan was on, he was like, the character that Christopher Lloyd's playing, he's essentially playing, like, a rapist?" And I was like, "Oh,
Yeah.
I
Yeah, which
never thought about that." Like, "What?" And he was like, "Yeah, and he's likable." And I'm like, "Oh."
mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
again,
I
it's
mean,
where you have, like, these rose-colored lenses on that you're like, I still like the movie. I love Christopher Lloyd, but yeah, they wouldn't do that today." I'm like,
no, no, not at
"Yikes."
all. Nope. That's
So,
that's a product of its time for sure. Yeah.
but
And that's what they
yeah,
did here.
exactly. It's
So,
like it's meant to be like a scandalous secret that someone has that they're trying to push down.
yep.
And so there's, a lot of reveals and they get more and more and more absurd. He reveals that he's that way, and then he reveals that actually he's not that way, and actually his name's something else. And then he comes back and he's like, I'm Sam again. It's like
Yeah.
it's meant to be silly, like not taken seriously.
Well, and that's the other part of it that I love is not only is it parodying and making fun of these individual characters. So you got your Sam Spade, you've got your Poirot, you've got, all of that. And they're
Perrier.
yeah, Perrier. They're making fun of all of those characters, but then on top of that, they have this ridiculous scene at the end that is every one of those characters' ridiculous tropes that ends a book, and then make fun of all of that and call it all out, which I loved. Like you can't just introduce a new character right at the end who hasn't been in the book before, or do this or do that. Like you can't do that, and I love that because I am unabashedly a lover of murder mysteries. There's just something fun about them, but it's true.
Agreed.
Especially those older ones. It's true. They were just silly and got to a point of self parody. So this was just taking it to a next level. There's actually a deleted scene, and apparent I never saw this on TV, so I can't confirm this, but what I read was in the TV cut of it, they added this in at the end of the movie as they're all leaving. um, Sydney and Willie are driving and they see this older car, this old vintage car driving up, and it's Sherlock Holmes and Watson, and they're heading towards the house. And they ask him for directions to Lionel Twain's house for dinner. And Sydney or Willie's trying to be like, oh, you don't want to go there, and Sydney, he shuts him up and tells him where the house is, and as they're leaving, he's like, "Let the idiots find out for themselves."
That's
And that
funny.
I found that on YouTube and watched it, and it is pretty funny.
That's
Um,
good, I like that.
yeah.
But yeah, when
Uh,
you're talking about, like, the tropes on top of tropes and, like, constant reveals, I know I need to stop talking about this. I actually talked about this in another episode, but do you watch Rick and Morty?
I have seen some of it, but I'm not like a
Okay,
regular
okay.
watcher.
Well, there is an episode. I just finished the 4th season, so it's fresh in my brain, but there is an episode that I just can't get out of my mind that I thought was hysterical, and it was making fun of heist movies
Mhm.
and how, like, heist movies really are actually ridiculous and how, there's a twist after twist after twist after twist in getting the people to not, to not their plan doesn't go well because things, oh, I double crossed you, and then oh, you double crossed
Yep.
me, and like they kind of make fun of that a little bit. And I kept thinking about that in this movie when they kept like revealing more and more and more. And it's a comedy, so they're doing that on purpose. But it does make you think about genres that you even like. Like I like heist movies, but I was
Yep.
laughing really hard at the fact that
Oh,
Rick saying that they're stupid. I'm like, I guess they are,
yeah.
but I love them, and so I like being able to laugh at it, and so I thought that part was it kind of happened in Clue, but I think they cranked it up to like an 11 in this one, and I really appreciated the constant surprise reveals. That was probably one of my favorite parts of the movie.
Yeah, yeah. Well, what Clue did that I really liked was Clue took that idea and they made an interesting stylistic choice in having the multiple endings.
Yes,
And I
yes.
really wish I could have been able to see that in theaters because it would have been kind of interesting to like if the internet was alive when in a form like it is now when Clue came out in theaters. How interesting would those conversations be where you went to a theater and you saw one ending and someone else saw a completely different ending? Because
Yeah, I
originally it was only
know.
one ending at a time and different theaters got different versions of it.
I think that wound up hurting it though, I
It
will
definitely
say,
did.
because
Oh,
the downside to that is if you don't know that, then you're just like, "Okay," and then, like,
yep.
everyone saw a different movie. So I that is really interesting, and I would like to have that experience, but then I'm also like, I don't know, like, part of what makes me love that movie so much is the multiple choice ending.
Oh, for
So
no,
so
it's definitely the best version of it. It's an interesting thought experiment to be
Oh,
like,
for sure.
well, what would that be like? But what I and this movie just went the opposite, which is we're just going to pack all the endings in at once,
It's just
and
funny. Yeah.
it's just so great. It's great because you get even if you've never seen it before, you kind of sense that coming the second. You know, like the movie isn't trying to hoodwink you. It's not trying to trick you
Right. There's no
at
real
all.
mystery. It's more like just jokes,
Yeah,
bits. Yeah.
and they just keep peeling them back until finally, like the ultimate one at the end, which is that it was the maid all along. Um, and it was not Rhoda; it was Rhoda's sister. Because Nancy Walker was Ida in Rhoda.
Oh, yeah.
Um, but I like that. Like, it's just, I, it's fun. It's a fun movie, and you need to have those. Not every movie
Yes.
has to tell a story, like has to have a message to it. You mentioned heist movies. I love heist movies, but it's true. They're dumb, and there's always some weird like. I love the Ocean's films, but come on, you got to suspend a lot of disbelief to watch those.
Yeah, I mean, they're ensemble fun cast movies. I
Yeah.
mean, I mentioned, Army of the Dead, which is also a heist movie.
Hmm.
And they're just fun. I mean, you get a lot of caricatures of people
Yeah.
like in this film, and they're entertaining, and that's about it. And I think this does that really well. Some of the bits are like so over the top, especially like I think it's the was it the maid or the cook that's like, "Oh, actually, they weren't even a real person," and you're like,
Yeah.
"Come on."
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
love that.
He's holding up the clearly plastic arm, and he opens up the case, and it's a fake person. Um, I loved that. Like the silliness. It's funny because this movie's only like an hour and a half long.
Yeah,
I think it's an hour and 35 minutes. It's a nice, tightly scripted, paced really well, where it's quick. It doesn't, but it also doesn't feel like it's a short movie.
right, right,
Um,
right.
and that's where like again, you can kind of see where this movie was a big influence on Ryan Johnson when he was writing Knives Out,
For sure.
and that this and Clue and kind of Knives Out is the evolution of what this kind of thing started. Just take it, polish it a little bit, play it a little more straight. In terms of like, it's not going to be zany and completely off the wall, but we're gonna round those edges off a little.
Yeah, you gotta go with the comedy of the time, I think, and
Yeah. Oh,
we're
for
getting
sure.
further away from, like, these Agatha Christie type films too,
Hmm.
so I don't know if they lean too heavily into that, if people would even have a big reference point for those kind of films. I mean, I know the
Probably
Murder on the
not.
Orient Express had a reboot, and I think Brennan's thinking about doing more, or is already. I think there's another one coming out soon. But
Which,
I
did
I
you see
wouldn't.
that, by the way? Did
I
you?
did, yeah.
Because I enjoyed it. I
I
mean,
enjoyed it
but
too. I mean,
again,
it
I
wasn't, like,
like
amazing, but
no.
I appreciated it, and I was like, "I wouldn't be mad if there were more of these." Like, if you keep making more, I'll keep seeing them.
Yeah, I love a good ensemble cast that works well together, and that was one. That's what made Knives Out work, is that the cast. That's what makes this movie work.
Yeah.
If the cast isn't as stellar as it is here, and everybody's not on their game and having fun, have fun with what you're doing. I think one of the other trivia bits I read was members of the cast or crew or somebody were like, "Boy, if the people watching this movie in the theater laugh half as much as we did while we were making it, we have a hit on our hands." Type of
Nice.
thing. And like, I love that, because you are playing silly characters. I mean, David Niven as Dick Charleston is completely out of nowhere, but I loved it. He owned it. It was, I, oh, by the way, shout out to James Cromwell for wearing the nice lacy, sheer black nightgown thing that he had on. Cause that
Yeah.
was him and his long, long legs. Cause that dude is like 6'6".
Oh,
I mean,
wow.
he is a big, tall dude.
Yes. Agreed.
And the other thing too is it's a small cast. You literally, I mean, everybody in the cast fits in one page on IMDb. You don't have to do the full cast and expand to see anybody else, because that's all they needed. They didn't need any other people to make this. They shot it on a stage, so that keeps the cost down, which makes a movie like this something that can be really profitable too. Um,
Yeah, I agree. And that's the youngest I've ever seen James Cromwell. In fact, I think it was his first movie, right?
yeah, he had done some TV, I think, beforehand, but it's definitely the youngest. Yeah, it was like his first or second movie, and he's doing a ridiculous accent, but then I love the humor of he's French and doing that French accent, or Belgian or whatever. You've got Perrier, who is Belgian, who has an accent, but he makes fun of the French accent that James Cromwell is doing. At one point, telling him,
Yeah.
"Don't ever talk to me with an accent," like,
Yeah.
because he's saying things like, "I feel it in my bones," but it comes out sounding like buns. And of course, Perrier just wants food all the time. That's all he's thinking about. So he hears the word bun. Oh, I love that. Like that is the type of humor that I just tickles me when it's that silly. Two men with French accents, and one of them is like, "Don't talk about the accent." Or the toupee joke was great too,
Yes,
where,
yeah.
"Of course I wear a toupee. They all know. I didn't know that you did." So yeah, I get the problems that some people can see with the movie, especially in the surface level. If you don't watch it and you just hear about it, like you hear, "Oh, Peter
Yes.
Sellers plays a Chinese detective." Ew, like that's
But
you
there's,
just
like,
hear
a
that, you're gonna
James Bond
cringe.
movie where he pretends to be Japanese for, like, half the movie. That was weird.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, Sean Connery doesn't pass as Japanese whatsoever.
No,
So,
so, like, think of it from that background of, like, a lot of movies unfortunately did this, and there was, like, a fascination around, I think, Asian culture at this time too.
mhm,
So it was sort of coming into Hollywood more, but probably not in the best way. Um,
no,
but yeah, like, I think if you have that background of, like, just so you know, this is by far, the not the only example of that in old
yeah,
movies. So you kind of have to know that going into. I mean, again, like you said earlier, I understand, but at the same time, it's like, well, I've had people tell me that they were uncomfortable with certain aspects of Blade Runner and they can't watch it, and I'm like, okay, that's, I'm just sitting here like, oh my gosh, it's like one of my favorite movies ever. Okay, that's fine. So it's like, it is sort of like you keep saying, it's context for sure.
Yeah, context matters, and I
Yeah.
think if this were if this were not a movie that was made to be beyond a 12 in the 1 to 10 scale of ridiculous,
Yeah.
then it would definitely be something that I would probably not watch anymore. But
Well, yeah,
because of
because
the
now it would be
context
like,
of
well,
it,
you know what to do. And I mean, this
yeah.
is something that happens to comedy, right? Comedy is really influenced by society, by what it's
Mhm.
observational humor a lot of times. So what's funny at the time is what's observed at the time.
Yeah.
So that's why, when people say things like, "Oh, Blazing Saddles could have never been made today." You're right. That movie was made for racism in the 70s. It
Mhm.
is 2021. So that would be a very different movie now because we're different now.
Yes.
And so comedy does change and evolve, and that's why sometimes when you go back in the way back machine, and I feel like it is a darker and more, I don't know if I should say more real, but it is definitely not sugar coated look at the way society thought back then.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? And I think that's what comedy does, is sort of put on screen like what we're all thinking. And so that's why sometimes when you watch an older movie, it doesn't age well because the way that people thought that back then was different than now.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely, and
hopefully that rambling makes sense, but you know what I mean.
you get the same thing in the written word and in literary
Yeah,
works too.
exactly, yeah. Mhm.
If you read Lovecraft, for instance, I mean,
Oh, for sure.
H.P.
Agatha Christie,
Lovecraft was
actually.
Agatha Christie too. Like they didn't have great progressive views, but you can kind of I don't it's not condoning or it's not like dismissive of that because that is part of it,
Mhm.
but there are other things to take from it. So,
Right, and,
yeah,
like,
I
you can
mean,
update them, like, we just talked about Murder on the Orient Express, like, the way that they kinda tried to deal with some of her, honestly, just flat out xenophobic things that she put in
yep,
her writing, they altered some of the characters to be from different backgrounds and to make sure that, things were presented in a different way. She still wrote great mysteries, we just don't love that part of it, you know what
right,
I mean?
exactly.
So it's like, and the further back you go, I mean, honestly, the worse it gets. So
Oh,
sometimes
sure.
these things need to be updated. And I think that if they made a murder by death movie today, it would be hysterical and they would just change a few things. So
Absolutely.
yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you would change things around and update it and have it be more reflective of the time,
Mhm.
and that's fine. That's progressive. I mean, progressing. We should be
Yeah.
progressing and evolving as a species, and that's what we're doing, but you also can't forget the past
Yeah.
and
You don't
forget
want to
what's
like
happened.
put people necessarily under the exact same lens.
Mhm.
That you view things, and I think there's a way to kind of to do both,
Yes.
to sort of look at the things that you would like to be different, but also not be like, well, I can't watch any movie pre 1980 or something. You know what I mean? It's like, because honestly that's what it would probably take, because there's a lot of stuff that,
Oh,
again,
yeah.
I've even had friends be like, oh, I'm watching this movie from the 60s, and I'm like, oh yeah, I like that one, and then they're like, oh my gosh, this is very sexist, and I'm like, well, yeah, it's the 60s, you know?
Right. It's
So, you kinda have to know that going in.
Mhm. Yep.
But, honestly, a lot of times, maybe not in this film so much, but in a lot of movies, they're actually sometimes more progressive than the times, and so even some of the things that we think of as, like, "This wasn't progressive enough," I'm like, "Well, but for the time, it was, like, leaps and bounds," you know?
Yeah.
So, again, learning a little bit about what was happening at that time and learning a little bit about, the thought process and writing it and things like that can kinda help you contextualize stuff better, for sure.
Sure, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. But I do think if you like murder mystery and you like comedy
Yeah,
at all, this is worth seeing.
I
It's
think
worth
so too.
finding. It's a cheap one to rent. You
Yeah,
don't
I
have
think
to
I
be
paid
like
like
me and buy it,
3.99.
but as a rental, check it out. It's like I said, it's an hour and a half long. You're not making a huge time investment, and
Yeah, and you get to see a young Maggie Smith, who doesn't wanna see that?
yeah, I'm not going to complain about that one bit.
So cool. Um, okay, well, do you feel like we covered every scene, everything in the film that you had on your list?
I mean, I think so. I loved the ideas of like how the house is set up and everything
Mhm.
is a ruse. and they're immediately noticing all that. Um,
Yeah.
whether it's the outright like, oh, there are there are marks outlined for their shoes
Oh,
on the
yeah.
front step where they need to be standing so the statue will fall on them, down to
Yes.
like Dick and Dora going into their room and it's covered in cobwebs and they have the whole big long kind of build up to this is where Mrs. Twain killed herself. Um,
Oh, yeah, that "I killed herself" line is really funny.
yes, that where she was murdered by herself, and they're like, "What, you mean suicide?" No, no, no. It was definitely murder. She hated herself. Like
That's very funny.
it's and then they open it up and it's just covered in cobwebs and they're freaking out by it. And I love that where once Dickie figures it out and he's like, "Oh, this is baking flour and it's cotton candy for everything. The mouse is probably fake too." And he picks up the mouse. He's like, "Oh, no, that's real." Um, like it's just it's so good. There's so much to enjoy about this movie.
Yeah,
Um, and it has a lot of joy to it. There isn't like none of the jokes and none of the humor in it is mean spirited. And I think that is something that is very much a product of like 70s humor,
I
like
agree.
zany humor like that. Like this kind of movie, there's no mean spirited jokes that unfortunately I do see in more in a modern comedy. It's not as cynical. Maybe is the thing. It's not a cynical type of comedy,
I
and I
agree.
I very much appreciate that. So yeah,
Yeah.
watch the movie. You'll like it.
Yeah, I think, this is a classic film that maybe not everyone has seen, but it's certainly on a lot of lists. Like I saw
Hmm.
a list earlier today that was like, if you like Knives Out, watch X, Y, and Z. And
Oh
this was
yeah.
on there because it is sort of like the forerunner for those other films. So, you know, um, that's a really good reason to check it out. It is
Hmm.
a classic film, and yeah, I really enjoyed it. I would definitely watch it again. Uh, if you had to summarize in like a sentence or two why you've seen this movie so many times, what would that be?
It would probably be Obi-Wan Kenobi hamming it up.
I like that. That's a pretty good sell too. Is that also your pitch for the movie? Like,
Oftentimes, yeah. It's basically if you want to watch Obi-Wan Kenobi and Columbo, and what's it, Professor McGonagall in the same movie.
there
Here
you
you go.
go.
They're all
Yeah,
there.
that's a really good sell. That's a good sell. Yeah, I think, we've talked about a lot. I think I want to thank you for being willing to tackle that aspect of the movie because I know that's tough when you really love a film, but it has some problems that can be hard to talk about, because we don't want to like come down really hard on a movie that you love. But I'm glad that you were open to having that conversation. I know I feel like I am too with movies that I love, and people point out things, I go, "Yeah, uh-huh, absolutely." So that is an aspect to watching older films, but as with this film, I do think that could be a hurdle for some, but if
Mhm.
you're able to overlook that and sort of contextualize it with some of the stuff we talked about, behind the whys of why that character is the way that they are, I think that it's a really funny movie and it's got a wonderful cast. Despite this portrayal, I really like Peter Sellers too because I love the Pink Panther movies.
I
So
do too. And
yeah,
again, I really feel like if he were alive in an era like we are now and things had progressed the way that they were, I feel like he would have come to a point where he's like, "You know what? Yeah, some of this probably doesn't work as well, but it was a different era and I should have been better and I would be now."
yeah. I mean, think
Like
about
I
like Hank Azaria being Apu.
Yeah.
And he kind of went on a journey of being really defensive about that
Mhm.
portrayal and then eventually being like, "You know what? I get it now." And you got to respect that. Sometimes it takes people a while to get there. Again, they're influenced by their time and what they were hired to do. And yeah, I agree. I think you'd probably look back and say, "You know what? That was a miss. Would
Yeah.
not do that today."
Yep.
Um,
It's
yeah.
like Fisher Stevens and Ben from Short Circuit. Like it's the same type of
Yeah.
thing. He went through a similar journey to Hank Azaria where he eventually got to a point he's like, "Look, it shouldn't have happened. It did. I don't he has said that he wouldn't do it today. You couldn't do it today, but he also understands what it was at the time. So I can completely get if it's too much for somebody, and they don't like that. But if you can contextualize it enough to be like, okay, yes, this shouldn't have happened, but everything around it is done because it doesn't feel like it's done out of malice. Now, I'm saying that as a soon to be 40-year-old white man, so I'm probably less qualified to talk about this portrayal than most people, but. Um, I do think that it's important to think about things in that way. And the conversations are the important part. I am always willing to have a conversation about something like that and
Yeah,
why it
I
does and
appreciate
doesn't
that.
work. And if somebody wants to bring to me reasons why it doesn't work, I will listen to them and I will definitely have that conversation. So, and then having said all that, watch Murder by Death because you'll
Yes.
laugh. You will
Yes.
laugh quite a bit.
Yeah. So Travis, thank you so much for coming back on.
Well,
Uh,
thank you for having me.
yeah,
It's
it was
always
really
fun.
fun to talk about this. And I hope that people go and check this out and enjoy it. Where can people find you?
Easiest way to find me is I'm TV's Travis basically everywhere. TVS Travis. Twitter, I'm really active on. And then TV'stravis.com, you can find the Wait You Haven't Seen feed. The Highlander show, just search for Let's Watch Highlander. Um, and I've actually just started a new show I'm co-hosting called Side Quests, where two friends of mine and I are doing a different weekly challenge. We run for about 8 week seasons, and we'll do things like this week we are doing a culinary world tour where we're stepping out of our comfort zones and cooking a few meals this week with recipes from cuisines and countries that we've never made before.
Ooh, that sounds really
Um,
fun.
so that's a fun one too. That's called Side Quests. You can find that at twodorks.net, I believe is where that one is easy to find. So that's a fun one too. But yeah, TV's Travis everywhere. I'm gonna probably start using things like what's the one the kids are into now? The TikTok, I
Oh
think.
man, I'm so bad at that. I made an account, but I guess maybe it's because I work from home, but every single day I'm like, well, I'm already in my PJs. I don't want
I'm
people to see
actually
me like this. So I have
yeah,
a hard time doing it.
I'm using the side quest show as a means to maybe
Oh, good
start doing
idea.
something like TikTok because I work from home as well. So it's like great, I can make TikToks of me sitting at my desk for the 14th day in a row. This is not entertaining at all. But now that I've got these kind of challenge things that I've got to do every week, it gives me something new to work with. So,
Yeah, I
um,
think as I get out more,
mhm.
I think
Yeah, that'll make a difference
it'll
too.
make a difference. But yeah, it's like I put on, makeup and a nice outfit when I'm gonna be on a Zoom call, and that's about it. So it's
Well, that's
like
more than I do. So,
well, yeah, different jobs, I guess. Different
yeah, I just don't
expectations.
turn my camera on.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's getting to be more and more that way. That may be another reason why they coax us back into the office. They're
True.
like, "Okay, we
True.
haven't seen you in a few months. Are you okay?" Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, so that's awesome. Yeah.
Oh, and speaking of weight you haven't seen, you're going to be coming back on soon.
Yeah, I
Um,
am. I'm gonna be
You
coming back.
so you actually inspired 2 episodes. I
Oh,
just want you to know.
thank
The
you.
one that you're coming up for, which is The Crow, because you mentioned in talking about Dark City that you had never actually watched The Crow all the way
Isn't
through,
that wild?
which is very wild given that entire episode you talked about how much you love Dark City and then you say, "But I've never seen The Crow." And I was actually out walking doing a trail hike while I was listening to it, and I immediately pulled my phone out to make myself a note to get a hold of you. Um,
I appreciate that.
but you also inspired me to cover Dark City a couple of
Oh,
weeks ago, so I got
good.
somebody to just
Oh, I
watch that
need to listen to that.
because I love that.
I
Oh, that
love that
movie
movie
is
so much.
so
I
good.
can't get enough. Like, I can't. I've seen
Yeah,
it
and I
a million
definitely
times.
am a fan of the director's cut.
Mhm.
Um, and I realized that because I didn't see it initially, I saw it a couple years later, and I realized that the first time I saw it was the director's cut. So I got kind of lucky that way,
I think the
in
first
a
time I
way.
saw it was with the narration, but the director's cut's way better, way better.
Absolutely,
And that's not always
absolutely.
the
So
case. Sometimes with some movies, I'm like, well, it's a little. a little long, but with this movie, I think it's kind of like, I think we said it's kind of like, what's that movie? Man, my memory tonight is has been bad. But the Rabbit, time travel, Jake Gyllenhaal, Donnie
Oh, yeah, yeah,
Darko.
yeah, Donnie Darko.
Yeah, Donnie Darko's like that, where it's like, well, the movie gibberish, the director's cut bueno, very good.
Yep. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, yeah,
Much like, Blade Runner, you brought
yeah,
that up earlier, and that's
yeah,
the same way where, like, treat your audience with some respect, and
yeah.
filmmakers wanna do that. It's usually studios that don't.
Exactly. Although with that one, I like the director's cut, not the final cut. Picky, but
Yeah. Yeah, there are some slight differences there, that's
yeah, the
true.
final cut I felt like took it a little too far. Like, bring it back a little bit. But
But
still
yeah, so
all good.
your recent episode on Dark City inspired 2 different
Oh,
episodes of my show in
well,
the
thank you so
coming
much,
up,
and thank you
so
for coming on, and again for letting me be like, we gotta talk about certain things about this movie, but I still wanna talk about it, and so, thank you
sure,
so much for being open.
absolutely.
Please don't be discouraged from picking other films.
Not at all. Nope.
We'll
I had a great time. I love your show, so
oh,
it's
thank
it's
you.
always fun to come on and talk because what I like about your show is you're like me where I like just about everything. It's hard for me to not like a movie. I just recently covered The Last Airbender.
Oh my.
Um, yeah. Look, I have done 116 episodes of my show at this point. 114 of the 116 movies I would gladly watch right now. The Last Airbender, not one of those. That movie's
I
not
saw a
good.
movie like that recently where I was, like, almost tearing my hair out, and I admitted in the Patreon that I hated it. Um, but it's rare, like, I'm very tolerant of most movies.
Yeah, I can almost always find something that I enjoy in a movie. And there was one thing I liked about Last Airbender, and that was the music. The music was great. Everything else about that movie is not worth watching. But I that's what I like about your show is just celebrating and enjoying a movie.
Yeah, I
And
mean, there's so much out there, and it mentally exhausts me. I always tell the story of, like, there was a show I used to listen to, and the 2 co-hosts would just argue with each other and get really ugly and, like, personal when they would, like,
mhm.
talk about a movie, and my husband would be like, "Can you just turn it off?" Or he was like, "Can you put your headphones in? I can't listen to it anymore." And I was like, "You know what? I actually feel the same way, but I've just been drudging through it, and I realized, like, I would rather listen to people talk about something they like. Like, I love, that show, How Did This Get Made? Because they'll pick on a movie, but in, like, the most loving and hilarious way, and then they
Mhm.
always at the end make sure to be like, "Here's everything I liked about it," and so I have fun listening to it.
Oh, absolutely.
And you should have
Um,
fun listening to podcasts, I think.
Film Sack is another great movie discussion podcast if
Oh,
you
I'm gonna
haven't
write that
listened to that
down.
one. And that's been going. There's like 500 plus episodes of it, so
Oh,
you've got a
cool.
long back catalog. They've been doing it for 11 or 12 years now. But what I like about that show is they watch some crap. I mean, they watch some bad movies, but the movie has to be what they consider to be sackable. And so it could be a decent movie. And a lot of times they enjoy it, or even if they don't like it, they still can talk about it in a way that isn't just this is dumb and blah blah blah. No, they don't do that. And I appreciate that because even a bad movie, Hackers, is Hackers is bad, but it's great. It's great because it's not a wonderful narrative. It's just fun. It's entertainment, and that's what movies are supposed to be at the end of the day is entertainment. So
Yeah.
whether it's the goofiness of a Murder by Death or give me some Godzilla versus Kong. I had a great time with that movie, and that's dumber than a bag of hammers, but I loved it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
So
I had somebody on recently that was like, "I'm not an expert." I'm like, "Oh, well, if the requirement for this show is to be an expert, I should shut it down because I am not an expert." But I don't think you have to be you kind of are an expert about certain movies if you've seen them enough. And
mhm.
I think that's what's important is just being able to enjoy them and share them and make cinema accessible to people. I cringe. You talked about TikTok earlier. When I see TikToks that are like, film majors, and they pick on people that are like, Pulp Fiction and Citizen Kane, and I'm like, I agree with the sentiment, but those are good movies. But I think when people are too judgmental and too insistent, they can drive people away that maybe want to be a part of the conversation, and that's why
Mhm.
it turns into jokes about how dumb those movies are. So yeah, thank you. I appreciate you for saying that, and I always hope that people come and listen and have a good time and feel safe, like talking about the movies that they like.
Sure, absolutely. If you love the 1995 Mortal Kombat, love that movie. That's
Hmm.
great. I have no
Yeah,
problem with that.
no problem.
Uh, and if your favorite movie ever is Schindler's List, that's fine because it's a fantastic movie, but man, is it tough to watch.
it
So,
it is.
you know, that's the beauty of film and cinema and entertainment is that it can be all those different things.
Yeah, 100%. Well, Travis, thank you so much. This has been such a great discussion, and I hope to have you back soon.
Thank you. Anytime you want.